Okay, so if we followed Swinburne's argument this far and his rejoinders to objections, he might seem pretty reasonable. God wants there to be moral goodness in the universe, so he has to create truly morally free beings. That means that God can't get involved to keep them from doing every little, bad things all the time. People need to be able to suffer as a result of these moral choices, for these moral choices to be able to, for them to be real, and for us to be able to take moral responsibility for each other. Maybe God does stop things from getting too bad. Maybe he does intervene to keep keep people from suffering too much, or keep the world from ending. Right? So this may strike us as plausible so far, but somebody at this point might say, "Stop! Just stop for a second. Think about this scenario, right? I'm walking down the street. I see some creepy-looking guy pushing a young child." Like a 6 or 7-year-old child in the back of a dirty van, right? And the child is yelling, help me, he's not my father, right? And the creepy-looking guy finally gets the kid in the back of the van, slams the door shut, gives me a mean look, gets into the driver's seat of the van and squeals off, right? And I've got the license plate on the van, I've got my phone right here, and I say, okay, creepy-looking guy, we're going to put an end to this. 9-1. Wait. Yes, that child is likely to get hurt from what I've seen. Yes, I could do something to try to prevent that child from getting hurt. But you know what? Maybe more important than the suffering of that child is the opportunity for that guy to do the right thing. He's unlikely to do the right thing. But wouldn't it be great if at the last moment and when he's about to do something terrible to that child, he had a change of heart and didn't? And by calling the police, maybe I am preventing, I'm denying the universe the possibility of this wonderful moment, which is not likely to happen, I understand. But nonetheless, I'm denying the universe the possibility of this wonderful moment where at the last minute this creepy guy has a change of heart. So I don't call 911. And a few days later, the child turns up dead somewhere, dead in a ditch somewhere, right? And I tell you the story, you're my friend, and what do you say to me? Do you say, oh, good job, you did the right thing? I mean, it was a hard choice for you, but you did the right thing. Or do you say to me, you are deranged, you are depraved, you are an evil, evil human being, you could have helped that child, and instead you did nothing, right? Now, just for the sake of argument, I might say to you this, I might say, now, wait a second. You believe in God, right? Sure. Well, I stood on that street corner the other day, and I could have called the police and prevented something bad from happening. But if you believe in God, then you believe that there were two morally efficacious beings who were out there on that street corner. There was me and there was God, right? Now, me and God both did exactly the same thing, which is nothing. You describe me as depraved because the child ended up dead. But do you call God depraved? Do you curse God? Do you say God should have stopped that creepy guy from killing that child? No, you say, hallelujah, we love God, right? Somebody might ask at this point, well, now wait a second. Yes, it does seem like I have a positive moral duty to intervene to help that child in that situation. And if I have that moral duty to intervene to help that child, well, why doesn't God have some moral duty similar to that? God doesn't necessarily have to call the police, of course, right? But God could do a variety of things. He could give the van a blowout tire, right? Or you could give the creepy guy a massive coronary heart attack, right? He could do something. Instead, he does nothing. And if God does nothing, then why don't we curse him in the same way that we would curse a human being who did nothing in that scenario? The password for today, the attendance password, by the way, is coffee. Coffee. C-O-F-F-E-E. Coffee. Okay. So the question that Swinburne wants to consider at this point is this. that if it is my duty to stop a child from being hurt, why doesn't God have the same duty, or at least a similar duty, right? And to this, Swinburne has a two-part answer. He says, in the first case, well, notice that knowledge changes our moral duties. What we know about the world changes what we are morally responsible for doing. Case in point, if I'm walking down the street at night near a beach, say I'm on vacation in Myrtle Beach or something like that, right? And I'm walking down late at night, and on the other side of a sand dune on the beach, I hear a woman's voice yelling, "Ah!" Right? Now, it seems like I have, as a good citizen, I have a moral obligation to at least run up to the top of the sand dune and make sure nobody's needs any help, right? Now, on the other hand, if I know that there is a beach party going on the other side of that sand dune, well, that changes things. Maybe I don't have a moral duty to go up and investigate. I hear a voice screaming. I think, oh, well, that's just the sound of merrymaking, having a good time, right? And if I do nothing in that situation, if I don't get involved, then it seems like I've done nothing wrong, right? So that's just an example of how knowledge changes our moral obligations, right? So if knowledge changes our moral obligations, Swinburne argues that, consider the difference between our human knowledge and God's infinite knowledge, right? God knows everything there is to know about a situation. He knows everything about the people involved. He knows everything about the moments leading up to it. He knows presumably everything that is going to come as a result of it, right? And so God, given all that knowledge, may have different moral duties with regard to when he needs to get involved. Now, what we're on the cusp of with that argument is something like this: that, for instance, maybe God knows that something terrible is going to happen today, but as a result of that terrible thing, something good is going to happen down the road, right? Take an example like this. This is sort of a familiar example, but imagine that there is there's a young man about 16 or 17 who gets caught up with the wrong crowd. He starts running with a gang, starts getting into it with drug dealing and so on, and he ends up one night while holding up a bodega corner shop. He ends up shooting the bodega owner, right, and killing the shopkeeper, right. So the young man is caught, he's tried, he's convicted as an adult, he's sentenced to life in prison, right? Now, for a while behind bars, the young man is very, very bitter and very despondent, right? But eventually, he comes around, right? Say he, begins reading the Bible, begins taking part in prayer groups, and he ends up educating himself behind bars. He ends up becoming sort of a mentor to new inmates. And he ends up doing, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, he ends up doing real good behind bars. Writes a book, right, about his crimes, takes responsibility for his crimes, and ends up doing a lot of good and helping a lot of people. And at one point in his book, he delivers he offers a sentiment which is very familiar to us if you've dealt with anybody who's suffered a lot or had a lot of problems in life. They say something, they typically will say something like, I've had a hard life and I've done some terrible things that I regret, but in the end, I think that God has put me where he needs me to be, right? He has put me where I could do the most good. And that's, unfortunately for me, is behind bars, right? But I would love to be outside, but maybe here's where God needed me, right? Now, this is a very familiar way of making sense of tragedy, it works, I think, for the person saying it, right? Of course, if we are the family members of that bodega owner, right, of the shopkeeper, we might say, couldn't God have put that young man behind bars where that young man can do the most good without murdering our father, without our father having to die? If God can't, well, he doesn't seem like God, then does he? Right? So this brings us to our next point here, right? That it seems like God uses us to teach each other lessons, right? That we are, I suffer, and as a result of my suffering, good things happen. Or you get your heart broken, and you're heartbroken now, but down the road, you're stronger, and you end up meeting the real love of your life down the road, right? So we know that good things come out of bad. Swinburne said, and that a necessary part of this is God perhaps using us in certain ways to teach others a lesson, right? And Swinburne says that isn't necessarily wrong for God, right? Here, Swinburne again makes use of his analogy to parents and children, right? God, again, is this ultimate cosmic parent. He has ultimate parental authority over us. And as such, he maybe is allowed to use us in certain ways to teach our brothers and sisters certain lessons, right? He has that moral authority. He has that moral authority in a way that we don't have over each other. Swinburne uses the analogy of, go back to that playground where the two siblings are fighting over the toy, right? Well, if you're just a stranger to those kids, or if you're just a daycare worker, you have a moral obligation to get involved right away to make sure they don't hurt each other, right? But the children's parents might have a special kind of authority to say, you know what, give them a second. I want to see what happens next, right? The parents would have that authority in the way that we don't have over each other, that strangers don't have over those children, and that we don't have over our fellow human beings, right? And as such, God may have that authority. God may have the authority as a celestial parent to allow that young man to kill that shopkeeper because God needs to teach that young man a lesson, right? Coffee. Okay. Okay, so what we've seen today is Swinburne fortifying the free will defense and to make it stand up to Mackey's attack, and dealing with a variety of questions and possible objections to the fortification of that free will defense. And Swinburne thinks none of these objections hold water if we think about them. So he thinks that the free will defense, as he's laid out, has made it at least possible that the God of the Bible could exist. And I want to pause for a second to point out that this scale of Mackey's argument in the previous article, that Mackey thought that he had proven 100% the God of the Bible could not possibly exist. The God of the Bible embodied a logical contradiction. The theist believed in a logical contradiction that could not possibly exist. To win this debate, Swinburne doesn't have to prove that God exists. Far from it. He doesn't even have to prove that it's likely that God exists. All he has to do to win this debate, because Mackey has set the bar so high, all he has to do to win this debate is to show that it's that much possible that God exists. Mackey thought that he showed 100% that God could not possibly exist. Swinburne wins this debate if he has shown that there is a 0.00001% chance that God exists. So we might leave this as a logical debate. We might call this argument in favor of Swinburne, even if we're generally atheist, right? Even if we think that that it's massively unlikely the God of the Bible exists, we might call this just because we find Swinburne's argument that much plausible, right? So I want to point that out as the sheer sort of scale of what Mackey was up to. Because along those lines, I think that most philosophers reviewing this debate over the problem of evil. When it comes to the free will defense anyway, they're much more likely, even if they're atheists, they're much more likely to say that Swinburne and the people on his side win the argument as framed by Mackey, just because they make it at least a little bit, they make it at least logically possible that God exists, right? The major limitation, it's universally agreed, the major limitation of the free will defense is that, well, it may be worthless. There seems to be a whole bunch of suffering in the world that seems to have nothing at all to do with the bad choices of human beings, right? These are suffering. This is suffering that results from things like hurricanes, earthquakes, natural causes, diseases, coronavirus, cancer. All of these sort of what is sometimes called natural evil doesn't seem to have anything to do with bad human choices. So it's very, very hard for most people to see how it is that the free will defense can cover the natural world. And if it doesn't cover the natural world, then it's worthless, right? If we still need an explanation for why God allows natural evil, well, then the free will defense is just extraneous. We can use whatever reason we have for why God allows cancer and earthquakes to cover why God allows serial killers, right? Even if we think the serial killers have no free will. So it's a big issue. It's a big issue that's often tacked on as just a minor footnote. By the way, exactly as Swinburne treats it in this article. Swinburne, jabbers on and on about but he goes on and on and on about the free will defense, and then in the last couple of pages, like, oh yeah, there's also this issue of natural evil. That's really hard to suss, but here's a couple possibilities, right? So let's consider those possibilities. Next, we turn our attentions to the question, well, what? Swinburne, pray tell, what about natural evil, right? How can we account for that? Well, before we get into that, Swinburne makes mention of something that we should bring out on the carpet here. These chairs on my way. He makes mention of another philosopher, a philosopher named Plantinga, right? And he mentions Plantinga because it was actually Plantinga who previously, or prior to Swinburne, Plantinga had laid out the major features of the free will defense in a logically formal way. Swinburne here is actually presenting a sort of scaled down, easier to understand version of Plantinga's arguments, right, about free will and the existence of God. Swinburne is writing for other philosophers, and he realizes that philosophers who have paid attention to this issue are probably familiar with Plantinga, and Plantinga made some very famous and in some cases infamous arguments. And Swinburne, first of all, needs to deal with this legacy that he's inherited from Plantinga and what people are in this debate know about Plantinga. Plantinga, in a very, very infamous move, when it came time for him to explain how it is that the free will defense can explain natural evil, Plantinga said, well, all of the theistic textbooks, the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran, they all talk about fallen angels. Right? They all talk about God having created some angels who turned against him. God gave these angels, before they turned against him, he gave them a lot of control over the natural world. Then they turned against him, right? And he allows them to do evil in the world. And if we take those stories seriously, Plantinga said, then we actually can extend the free will defense to natural evil in the world. And we can say, well, earthquakes and hurricanes and coronavirus are the results maybe of angels who were giving stewardship over this world of misusing their powers. And God can't stop to intervene them for the same reason that he can't intervene, or can't intervene to stop them for the same reasons that his hands are tied to intervene to stop us from hurting each other. Right. Now, as you might imagine, this didn't sit well with a lot of philosophers. A lot of philosophers who were willing to, for the sake of argument, take the arguments of people like Plantinga and Swinburne seriously for the sake of argument, for the sake of this debate. You're asking too much of them when you begin to introduce fallen angels and demons to do serious work in your philosophical theory. This is where most philosophers are going to say, no thanks, but no thanks. That's going too far. That's silly, right? So Swinburne doesn't want to rely on fallen angels to explain the natural evil there is in the world. He makes reference to this. He says that Plantinga is right, that there, all three of the theistic traditions do have a place of fallen angels in the natural world. But Swinburne very quickly wants to change the subject and say, but we can do better, right? So what are his better options for explaining the natural evil there is in the world? Well, let's consider. Right, here they are. Just found them. In the first case, Swinburne says, so the existence of diseases and natural disasters in the world, they make more opportunities for virtue, right? Look at the scientists right now working very, very hard to come up with a cure or a vaccine for the coronavirus, right? A lot is being demanded of those people. A lot of their intellect, a lot of their hard work is going into helping other people, and we would be, and this is providing opportunities for them to really shine. And as we've been talking about this whole discussion, God, it would seem, really ultimately cares most of all about opportunities for virtue. So the problems of the natural world would cause just a little extra adventure for us, right? Secondly, Swinburne comes up with a novel way of describing how it is that the problems of the natural world might actually enhance our human freedom, right? Imagine this, there are a variety of shows on television now where people buy houses that are distressed and they fix them up. They put in what's called sweat equity. You buy a house at a very low price, you work really hard to fix it up, and then you sell it. You flip the house for at some price, right? Or you move in yourself, right? So we're familiar with this idea of buying a kind of unfinished house and putting in the work to finish it yourself, right? And Swinburne wants to point out that the advantages of doing that to a house is that you feel connection with it, right? If you have to hang the wiring in the house, if you have to put up the walls yourself, you feel connected to that house in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise, right? Furthermore, and most importantly for Swinburne's argument, an unfinished house allows you to pick your own path. It allows you to choose what kind of house you're going to have. If you have an unfinished house and you say, you know what, I think I'd like to knock down that wall between the kitchen and the living room and just have like a big open area, well, you can do that. And then at the end of it, you're going to have a house that looks the way you want it to look, and that you feel this very strong connection to because of your hard work, and because it reflects your creativity and because it reflects your hard work, right? Well, Swinburne says we can apply the same thing to this natural world, right? God had a range of universes that he could have created. He could have made the Earth, the surface of the Earth like the surface of the moon, right, where no living thing can survive. On the other extreme, he could have made paradise on Earth, where it's always perfect, nothing needs to be changed, no tree needs to be chopped down, it's always sunny and 75, right? Instead, Swinburne says what God created was he created a universe somewhere in the middle. It's a universe that's generally amenable to life, but needs the hard work of individuals and the community coming together to to turn it into a world that's better, right? And better and better and better. A world that is more and more amenable to human life and more reflective of the control that human beings, when they work hard and come together, the control human beings can exert over their environment. As such, Swinburne says, there is a connection, he thinks, between human freedom, moral freedom, and this unfinished natural world, the natural struggle in the world, that we are actually freer, Swinburne says, in an unfinished universe, a half-finished universe, than we would be in a universe that's just turnkey, that's just perfect in every way. We are freer to transform the world into something that we want to see, right? Now, this is the time, if we were live in person, I would throw it out to the group to have a critical analysis and have a discussion about, who wins, Mackey or Swinburne. So think about that. Think about who, in your mind, wins this debate, Mackey or Swinburne, and why? Because as I pointed out before, it's perfectly possible that just taking these two authors and just taking the arguments that they give, it's perfectly possible to be a Christian who thinks that, well, Mackey wins this argument, or to be an atheist who thinks, well, Swinburne wins this argument, because we're not necessarily talking about the larger issues, right? We're not talking about other arguments. We're just talking about these two fighters, right? Furthermore, I want to leave you on this. I want to leave you pointing out something that I think that I pointed out at the end of Mackey, and I want to bring that sort of tie that bow off here at the end. I think even if we follow Swinburne through all of this and nod our heads this whole way and say Swinburne's got it, Mackey says something as kind of a throwaway line that I think ends up having a lot of resonance, maybe, even if we agree with Swinburne at the end of this. Remember, Mackey said that, a God that only cares about opportunities for virtue and doesn't really care about the suffering of individuals. Mackey said, well, that's not a God who cares about your life. That's not a God who cares about you and the people in your life and cares about your suffering. That God only cares about opportunities for you and for other people to do brave and heroic things. That's a God that may care about the human race generally, but doesn't care that much about individuals. And I think it's interesting to sort of look back on that comment made by Mackey at the end of what Swinburne has done here, because when we're talking about, a half-finished universe allowing us to express our freedom and creativity and reforming it, I don't know. I mean, what about all the, that's really great for the Haitian orphans who have to, drown in an earthquake, right? Or that's really great for those, it's going to be really great next fall or next year when the ingenuity of scientists, results in a vaccine or a cure for the coronavirus. But what about the tens of thousands of people who've had to die along the way? If we're really willing to say, well, those lives are worth the greatness of the vaccine, the greatness of whatever good comes out of it, then I think Mackey's got a point. That doesn't seem like a God that's terribly concerned about each individual life. And I think ultimately, to me, that is the hardest thing. I think that's the hardest thing for the theist to square in this conversation. It's really, really hard to come up with a theistic defense of God that doesn't end up in some way backing off or downplaying the suffering of individuals. It says in the Bible, of course, that God cares about all the individual suffering. He knows the suffering of every sparrow, he says, right? Great, but that doesn't seem to be, aside from that one sentence, that doesn't seem to be how God treats suffering throughout the rest of the Bible, let alone the rest of creation. And I think, to me, that the hardest thing out of this is to end up squaring the defense of God with it's hard to effectively defend God in this argument without coming up with a God who's basically indifferent to individual suffering. And I think that would come, the idea that there is a God who cares about human beings generally, but doesn't care about you, would come as a shock to most theists. And I think that's not a God that many people would go to, get up on Sunday to worship, right? So anyway, that is Swinburne. So, okay, everybody. Have a good day. Stay safe.